All right, hi, folks. It's the lecture number 5 in Anthropology and the Human Condition on the 14th of October, Thursday group. And welcome. Today we are talking about Levi-Strauss and Jacques Derrida's essays, or half a book really, on Levi-Strauss's, a couple of pages in Levi-Strauss's Tropiques. And as I've said, if you were to read only one book, that would be a crime, but if you only read one book in anthropology, Tropiques is possibly the one that you would read. Of course, there are many others, but I certainly think that one's a good one, even though it's now nearly 70 years old, 67 years old, 66 years old. It's amazing. So Claude Levi-Strauss, we're reading that section that I put on the e-learning in Tibet called The Writing Lesson. Although we'll look at Derrida's essay, The Violence of the Letter from Old Grammatology in 67, two sections especially of that, the Battle of Proper Names and the Writing Lesson proper. And just Derrida's commentary on a page, on each section is basically a commentary on a page from Levi-Strauss's fieldwork notebooks. Fieldwork, interesting thing to say with Levi-Strauss. Some people say he didn't do. He did, anyway. He was in South America after his PhD, right? So for, actually, I don't know how many years, 4 or 5 years. He taught in Brazil, but each break he would go into the Amazon. So it wasn't a long-term, months in a tent among the village kind of field work. He was moving from group to group with a bunch of other people and his wife, Sophie. And in a way, he's trying to get to the people that are not yet touched by Western civilization. And Tropiques is the recognition that they are all very much touched, in fact, decimated by the infections that came with European civilization. Even before some of the Amazonian tribes met actual Europeans, they were already dying in huge numbers because influenza, and other diseases, measles, and sexual diseases, which the Europeans had brought to the Americas, swept through their communities much quicker than the explorers risked going into the jungle. And the numbers aren't clear exactly how many, but already before even having met any Westerners, their lives had been transformed. Many killed, many died from illness, and then of course there were many died in violence and encounters with the explorers and developers and those who are putting through the telegraph lines to connect up remote parts of the Amazon, which were basically small villages, settlements connected by river, and communication was difficult for the Europeans. Anyway, Levi-Strauss does this fieldwork, but it's itinerant, intermittent fieldwork. And really his huge contribution is to theory. And his first book, Elementary Structures of Kinship, is a study of kinship, says it on the title, and looks at introduces a structural analysis to the question of exchange, and especially exchange of women, women as a kind of trading commodity among communities, using a lot of material from Malinowski and Mauss, and then his next book on totemism rethinks totemism completely, a topic that had gone into neglect or disuse, or no longer was discussed, and Levi-Strauss brought a structuralist, brought a new kind of analysis to that, going back to some of the work of Baldwin Spencer that we talked about in the second week. And then he produces Tristropics and the essay A Structural Study of Myth, which came out in a volume called Structural Anthropology, volumes 1, and then there was a later volume 2. And really his contribution, theoretical contribution, transforms anthropology, especially French anthropology, by introducing structuralism alongside, I mean, he's not the only structuralist, and it's not just in anthropology that structuralism happens as a phenomenon, because there's also Michel Foucault's work in history, I suppose, Jacques Lacan in psychoanalysis, and Roland Barthes in literature. And they basically the new intellectual wave that displaces the post-war or even pre-war success of Jean-Paul Sartre and Le Beauvoir and Merleau-Ponty and the phenomenologists. So very interesting that Tristropics is this book that effectively is Levi-Strauss's travel story, right? Yeah, he starts the book, here it is, in its various covers. He starts the book saying, here's the Tingviet version, which I just got yesterday. I hunted for it for quite a while. He starts the book by saying that he hates travelers and explorations. Yet here he is about to tell the story of his travels. Where's the start here? Well, I'm not going to risk my accent yet. Anyway, I've copied some of this for you. He hates travelers and explorers, and yet here he is to tell the traveler. He really dislikes those people that glorify their travels to the far ends of the Amazon and so on by bringing back a slideshow of pictures and talking about them, a bit like what happens in a lecture. Talking to glorify their travels with a lantern show and stories about the exotic. Yet here he is about to do that, and the book was massively successful. So he told these tales of his travels, and he's obviously here in this photograph, a bit like the ethnographer in the field, maybe not as carefully posed as Malinowski or Evans Pritchard and the other photographs of anthropologists we've looked at so far, but pretty authentic in this one, the anthropologist in the camp, and his burnt billy pots and tea making facilities in his mocked up camp table and stuff. Anyway, he writes this story about his travels and his reading and his meeting with people and all of the hassles, and it's interesting because in the different versions, and I want to tell this story by looking at the covers of the different versions, in the different versions over time, we actually see indicated on the covers, I think, or I'm making the case, a kind of shifting of the importance of this book over time, from when it was first published and the focus there through to up to today. And so what I want to look at first of all is, I guess, the publishing history of this book, Tristropics, Sad Tropics, or Cry for the Tropic, or for the Tropical, and yeah, it's it's interesting how interpretation of what it's about has changed over time. So at first it was, and this is indicated on the cover, very importantly about the structure of myth and the structure of this society, its exoticness. I mean, you see obviously a humanoid figure, but no face, and instead of a face, they have this drawing and a kind of vessel for a heart. Okay, and so the French probably knew that in South America there were, and I'm sure they weren't very specific about, they tried the Aztecs or the Incas or something, who used to do heart sacrifices and hold up a beating heart. That exoticism is kind of slightly linked here, or the heart here is a vessel. If it's a heart, it could be the lungs, I suppose. Anyway, the focus there is on this diagram, and it's one of Levi-Strauss's own diagrams. It was in the book. It was the cover of the book, sorry. And in the book, we also can see some others of his drawings of the diagrams that were on. There's one that we'll see on the cover soon. So they're in the book in black and white full page representations. I'm not getting very big pictures, but you get the idea that he's included some of these, and they're throughout the book as well. His drawings, see some good ones. So in the middle of the book. Get things like that. So there are his sketches from his field notes that he's included, and there are lots of other images and so on, but it's more his commentary on going to try and find these people that are quite exotic and different. And the point is they are different, and the markings on the face, which we see in the first English translation, another drawing, again from Levi-Strauss, you know, are really the strangest thing, right? Imagine these people, they tattoo their faces. They're the Codevo. Not everyone in South America do this. The Codevo, there are other examples. Do this geometric patterns on the face. And early on, it was comparative exoticism, right? How strange these people are, and how can we think of this? And you know, it resembles nothing so much as playing cards. Someone said, well, Clifford Geertz, who we read last week on Evans Pritchard, said that. They were, I think Levi-Strauss even says it. They reminded him of the back cover of playing cards. I did try and find a set of playing cards, but the only ones I could find was my kids' version of cards and the Alice in Wonderland pack, I'm afraid. Doesn't really indicate the sort of thing, but the idea was that on the back of the cards, right, there's the front with the Queen screaming, "Off with their heads! Off with their heads!" or whatever. First the trial, then first the sentence, then the trial, or whatever, from Lewis Carroll's great surrealist story. But on the back, there's always some kind of like tradition of design, right? And they've still done this a little bit in Alice in Wonderland, but you see this has got it almost looks like a heart on the eye of this person. Actually, the kind of cards I've seen, I see the traditional version of a pack of cards. Actually, I see cards lying about the street. I've been 4 years, right? I've been seeing them I don't know whether it's at a certain time or something, but quite often I see one card lying in the street. I mean, never a whole set. I mean, sometimes a couple of cards. If someone can tell me what that's about, I'd be interested, right? I mean, I know in Apocalypse Now there's a horrible scene where the general, American general, who loves the smell of napalm palm in the morning and says things like, "Charlie, don't surf," and sends his soldiers out to surf amongst the bombs. He throws down a card to, like, terrify the enemy on a dead body, a card marked by with his battalion or something like that. Just psyops, psychological warfare. But this is different. But I still, I don't know why it happens, but it could be completely coincidental. But all over different parts of Ho Chi Minh I've lived, I've seen this. If someone can explain that, that'd be great. But if not, anyway, the first thing was cut. Now we probably would also think that this is great material for disrupting facial recognition software, right? You see sometimes protesters put patterns on their face. Well, they could adopt some of these and it would help disrupt the facial recognition software. But that is in the framework of thinking these people are exotic and trying to explain their difference, right? So that's probably the first set of interpretations. But soon, structuralism became more prominent, more famous, more well-known, and more discussed. And it was the structure of the diagram that became emphasized. All right, this is an early American edition, and it see, there's something about the structure here. There's this diagonal line, and then on either side of the diagonal line, there's a almost mirrored, but not quite the same pattern. So you got one big curve on the top. You've got the same curve down below, but it has an extra bit. And this will become significant, or is significant in Levi-Strauss's thinking of the structure of myths when he comes to, which he started to do in this book, study myths. And then he does in this great 4-volume mega collection called Mythologiques, 4 volumes, 2,000 page work over a decade, almost, of amazing studies of nearly 1,000 myths. His studies, and works out their internal coherence, their logic, according to the patterns that he identifies. And it's interesting that this is an English edition. I think it says £2.75, right? So we can date that to 70s or something, where structuralism is still important, but the person's come back again, right? So we had drawings of people, abstract person, the drawings, then drawings of people, but the interesting thing is, aren't they strange, these people? Then just the drawings, now the drawings and the people. It's interesting. One of the early Ting Viet editions, maybe I got this out of sequence, so I'm just guessing because I couldn't find this version, but that's the cover of the first Ting Viet, first Vietnamese edition, and it's not necessarily identifiable tribal group, but very modern, and that's interesting. Sure, they've got decorations and so on, but different ones. Anyway, I couldn't find out when that was from, although the current one, this one that I just got yesterday, also has a image, although it's quite strange. Well, what is that? It looks like an image of a not specifically any particular tribal group, but a South American or an Indian from the Americas, done stylized in stone. So it's a photograph of some artwork, contemporary artwork. But that's just come out this year, so it should have been at the end of this list, because the early 80s version in English goes back to what it looks like. It's the tribe doing something tribal. They're in a ceremony, standing around. I suspect they're having a prayer meeting because they'd been converted to Christianity. But anyway, it's an image of them, not identifiably one of Levi-Strauss's images, because it's not in his book. You know, it's not one he takes, but it identifies the people and puts them back in history, right? It's an old photo, very obviously an old photo, right? Yeah, and that's the effect it's aiming for, I think, to show that this is a bygone time. And that's interesting that by the 80s, this book was no longer really being thought of in terms of the structural stuff, right, which we're going to get into later, but just in terms of how interpretation of the books changes, the people come back in, and it's the people that are interesting. So it's as an ethnography in a way, as a description of the Bororo and the Nambikwara and the Kudevo. The people have come back in as the focus of interest. Then by the 90s, early 2000s, the French edition has changed as well to focus on the people, and still exoticized, but this is, and still a photograph from Levi-Strauss, but they are made full frontal. This is about the people. The focus is on them again, and of course Levi-Strauss's book really was about these people and bringing these people into making them visible in the world discussion, I suppose, and that's important. At the same time, he's doing a critique of how Western capitalism, basically, colonialism, capitalism, have invaded their space and destroyed them. And his sad tropics, his lament, is for he travels all over the world effectively, and he sees the refuse and the filth of the West thrown in the faces of these people who live in the forest. In the 90s, this became a kind of, this is the Penguin edition from the mid-90s. They become kind of custodians of the forest. People of tribal origin were often discussed as, the people who knew how to look after the forest, and they should live in the forest, and a little bit more respect was shown to them. Of course, they are still exoticized. The cloth over the head is still. This is not a photograph from Levi-Strauss as well, though it's quite possibly of someone from one of the tribal groups there, Bororo or someone. But the book becomes something like a forerunner of ecological or a concern about pollution. So we call it climate change now, because we can't mention that it's pollution, but basically pollution, the filth of Western civilization that has invaded the forest and in fact cut down much of the forest, as we'll see in another version that came out around about the same time, into this one, where we still have the exotic indigenous person staring directly at the camera, but they're in an environment where the forest has been cut down. Basically, they're no longer in the forest, so they're a bit, maybe that they've cleared the forest. We don't know, but I'm talking about how this edition, which is the Penguin Classics edition, so coming out around 2000, how this is interpreted and supports a kind of changing interpretation of the book, which of course now, then Levi-Strauss dies in 2009 at 101 years of age, and he's become this heroic anthropologist figure, even if no one really read his work anymore so much, except for in anthropology classes. But the book then was presenting, actually, instead of the tribal groups, it was presenting him on the cover. So called Levi-Strauss, Tropiques. I mean, do you read too much? Do I read too much into the changes in the cover because I'm projecting and sort of backdating a story of how interpretation goes and how the book has been seen, perhaps, and yet looking at the secondary literature, which I've always kept up on, the way in which this book is discussed, and does kind of reflect these changes. Right? And indeed, you can see interesting changes in the other book that we're looking at, the commentary on Levi-Strauss by Jacques Derrida. So that commentary is in a book called Of Grammatology, or the one we're looking at is in Of Grammatology, or De la Grammatologie in French. Interesting, the French covers of books, I love these covers, are very stark and you know, report-like, scientific-like, perhaps, I don't know. Whereas a English language book always has a happy cover and so on. And this is an interesting one because it's a dragon, actually. I don't know if you can see the top part on the what's my left is like a dragon's head, and there are claws, but the body is made up of signs, language stands. You know, that reflects a version of the interpretation of structuralism at the time, right? It's reminding of not this, but this kind of image, evoking that somehow, but also recognizing that in Derrida's book, what is his commentary on Levi-Strauss owes a lot to the history of philosophies of language, going back to de Saussure's General Course on Linguistics from 1922, this same year that Malinowski published Argonauts of the Western Pacific. What a year. James Joyce also published Ulysses, and anyway, Ferdinand de Saussure's sign, signified analysis, his only book that was published, but his analysis of language from his course on general linguistics. Derrida, who's Derrida? What's Derrida writing about? Derrida, I should say a little bit about him. I guess he is a Algerian Jew, so born in Algiers, born as Jackie and buried as Jackie, but when he comes to France, he changes it to Jacques. Right, born in Algeria, and by the time he was getting to be a teenager, Algeria was going through its independence struggle. The Algerian Jews are kind of caught. They're disliked by the French colonizers and by the Arabic Algerians, and a lot of them moved to France. And that's, well, in Derrida's case, he's not a great student at school, but well, he is a great student at school, but he doesn't finish everything, which is like a pattern of his life in a way, because he goes to the high school in Algeria and comes first and so on, but then goes to similar school in France and doesn't complete the first year, but then submits the next year, and it's fantastic. He goes to the École Normale Supérieure, which is like the big school in Paris. Sartre went there, Levi-Strauss went there, de Beauvoir, Merleau-Ponty, all these people, right? It's a significant place. And well, his teachers are Louis Althusser and Michel Foucault. Althusser was the theorist of the French Communist Party, famous for Marx, for Lenin, Lenin in Philosophy and for Marx, those books. Also a structuralist, I suppose. Well, Althusser is interesting, right? Interesting and terrible. He was a manic depressive, right? So sometimes he had really busy, lucid periods, but then sometimes he was in a psychiatric ward, recovering from a depression and things. And Derrida would as a PhD student or what have you, as a junior member of the faculty, would take over his classes very often. Like in '68, when the revolution was happening, all the students are reading Althusser and kind of the revolution that he'd in part inspired. He wasn't around. He was in psychiatric clinic, having depression, and his dominance of French intellectual life in the '60s, especially in France, was quite a problem for Derrida, because there you had to. Althusser produced this book called Reading Capital, which gathers together many of the names that we still read now: Etienne Balibar and Jacques Rancière, although Rancière was kind of very critical and eventually on the outer. But Derrida stayed quiet about Marxism at that time, he says, because he didn't want to be taken as anti-Marxist, but he also didn't want to be caught up in this. He wanted to produce a more nuanced position. Anyway, that's also the nature of his commentary in Grammatology on Levi-Strauss and on Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It's like a style of writing that's very philosophical and follows what seem like diversions but turn out to be really on track, about writing and about the sign. He was studying for his PhD work, which he didn't complete until like many years later. And he's studying his first published work in '62 was a translation of Edmund Husserl, the phenomenologist, Edmund Husserl's work on the origin of grammatology, which is a rare and small work, but with a huge introduction by Derrida. And even then, mostly focused on just one little section in Husserl, where Husserl talks about writing and basically argues that without writing, there could be no science of geometry. Think of it this way: if Pythagoras, Pythagoras, the hypotenuse triangle theory, Pythagoras' theorem, couldn't be written down or chiseled into stone or whatever was being written down and passed to the next generation, we'd forget it. We would have to reinvent it again at some point. I mean, it might last through oral history, passing down one expert to the next, but it's really, to make a discipline of geometry, you need writing. And Derrida kind of obsesses about this, and it becomes his fascination. He tracks comments on writing through the whole of philosophy. Well, maybe not the whole of philosophy, much as he can get hold of, and he does such impressive work. And then in grammatology, the grammar of, well, the science of grammar, but he means something different actually. He's tracking writing and the discussion about the origin of writing. And of course, he finds these two scenes in Levi-Strauss that talk about it. And at this point, and why the cover has that Gayatri Spivak, the translator. Should say something about her as well, because she's like my mentor or teacher or friend, and now for 30 years or so. Wow, 86 till now. So yeah, 35 years. She translated this when she was a new graduate, finished her PhD and started working at Iowa University. She's from Bengal, from Calcutta, trained there, did her master's at Presidency College, then went for a PhD in America, and then started teaching in Iowa. And looking through a book catalog, saw grammatology, so that looked interesting, got hold of it, was blown away, and then wrote to Derrida and said, I'm translating your book. Not can I translate your book, but I am translating it, unheard of. And she writes a 100-page introduction to the book, which is interesting. It was also criticized, but this is the book she got from the catalog, so I don't know why that was grabbed her so much. And then she translates this, and it makes her famous and notorious because people question some of the obsessive Derrida lovers, Bennington and so on, who are like the high priests of Derrida studies, question her translation, but there are always matters of mistranslation. Anyway, she does correct some of the edition we've been reading is of grammatology from 1997, the corrected version, right? It doesn't say that on this cover, but the cover we've been using is the corrected. You see the cover's changed here from the dragon to this Egyptian hieroglyphic, Egyptian god writing, which is a great, of course, because right, hieroglyphics are that kind of traditionally taken as that kind of the beginning of writing, where pictures, signs start to become an alphabet. And this is, does anyone know which god? No, it's Thoth. Thoth. I have an image of Thoth writing. Here he goes. I don't know. How are you on your Egyptian gods? Do you know who these guys are? Anyone? All right. So on this side, on my left, the crouching down figure with a black face. Anyone? This kind of dog figure is Anubis. Anubis. I really love that character and such. Then this one with a kind of dragon head. No, crocodile head maybe. Is Sobek. Sobek. And then we have Thoth, who's an ibis. Then this one, I'm guessing this is Isis, just Atum. Anyway, a pharaoh figure. And then this one, whose beak is chopped off a little bit, is Khonsu. It's fantastic. I mean, there are so many others, and I used to teach a class at TDT, Introduction to Civilizations, where we'd work out from the hieroglyphs how to write our names. You can do that now. You can do it on the web, right? You can look up a site where you can sort of make a hieroglyphic version of your own name from a kind of cheap alphabet. It's a gimmick produced by, I guess it's the University of London that did it. Not the university, the museum of the British Museum that put it together. The version I was using anyway. So yeah, that's why it was on the cover. Well, because it's Thoth writing and because hieroglyphics are becoming alphabet, not quite yet. Right? It's still a pictogrammatic language. But the cover changes again for the 40th edition of the translation Derrida, and it's now much more focused on what is translation. And Gayatri Spivak, as translator, does it again and updates it a bit, but this time it's introduced by Judith Butler, as well as keeping Spivak's 100-page introduction itself, which is considered super brilliant. And what does Derrida actually say about Levi-Strauss? We should get into that. Maybe the way to do that is to stop sharing and read the text, which I think I can do if I look at this. Okay, here's the version I'm reading from Grammatology. And you'll see on the second page, this is the corrected edition by Spivak from 1997, although the 40th edition is a bit updated as well. See the reprintings. It was very successful, but again, it came out originally in French in '67. In that year, Derrida had become famous. Actually, in 1966, he became famous, really, by going to America as a stand-in for someone else who couldn't come. And he spoke at a conference at Johns Hopkins on structuralism, and basically declared structuralism dead. He gave this paper on Levi-Strauss called Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Humanities, and basically argued that structure was a projection. There was no coherence there was no center to the structure, and it couldn't hold. It was an interpretation. And then the next year, he brings out that essay inside a book called Writing and Difference. That same year, brings out Speech and Phenomena, his big book on Husserl, his second book on Husserl, but now not a translation. And at the end of the year comes this huge book, an important book, Grammatology. And the section we're reading is part 2, The Violence of the Letter, from Levi-Strauss to Rousseau. And there's a lot of stuff in this. There's a lot you need to kind of know as background. I guess you, like, even the preface quote, you need to know that Emile is by Rousseau. The name is there to give you the clue. And it's another comment on writing. It's almost like Derrida's strategy in the days before Google search is to go through all of the philosophical texts he could find, and any mention of writing he pulls forward and thinks about. So Rousseau says, dismisses writing. Shall I proceed to the teaching of writing? No, I'm ashamed to even toy with these trifles in a treatise in education. Well, interesting, because writing is so much a part of education, isn't it? And I asked you to comment on writing, thinking with this in mind, but thinking about how important being taught to write is for students now. Like, my daughter is being put through this, and I should probably as well, how to write letters, right? And she's doing these exercises of copying over and over, making the Tingviet letters. Here's and she's not doing a great job, maybe, but she's certainly neater in her handwriting than I am. And English students who now, they can text, but they can't. Handwriting is awful, but mine's certainly deteriorated since when I was a student, although I don't remember being forced to write neatly, whereas it's really impressive in Tingviet that you almost have a copperplate handwriting and that sort of. But for Emile, for Rousseau in the book Emile, as a part of education, not on the cards even, not part of the story. Yeah, and that's interesting. But the bit of this Derrida's text that I wanted to get into talking about today is a bit further on, right? It's called the Battle of Proper Names. It's where, in the essay on the origin of languages, how is one to distinguish in writing between a man who mentions and a man who addresses? Man one mentions and man one addresses. That really is an equivocation which should be eliminated by a vocative mark, a voiced mark. So making marks and voice and language, and Derrida's thing is following on from Saussure, the arbitrariness of the sign, and language is always metaphoric. All right. What do I mean by this? That our words for things, the sound that we make, the word we have, and the thing are just connected by agreement. Right? We call them those things because we've always called them those things. And they're in part of a set of names of different things. So, right, pen, which you'll call boot, right, in Tibet. There's no reason not to call it boot or pen or bus or train or any sound. There's no pen, the word pen and the thing pen is not connected. Although pen and pencil are connected in a system of writing objects. Pencil, pen. Why the difference? I mean, pencils came before pens. So why is pen, is it a shortened? Anyway, Saussure's thing about the signifier, signified, and the sign for something is about arbitrariness of the sign. I mean, book, sac in Tingret. There's no direct connection between the thing that we read, the word book that we write down, B-O-O-K or S-A-C-H, what, and the sound that we make, book. I mean, ooh always makes that sound, and the letters make that sound, but that's only because we've agreed on the alphabet, and we've agreed that that will be called book and not, could be something else, couldn't it? And that's where interpretive variation enters, the idiomatic. And Derrida's essay is a kind of commentary on how that leads us to errors. So anyway, Levi-Strauss has gone to visit the Nambikwara, right? And they're an example of the tribe he's always kind of in the anthropological fantasy wanted to meet, people that are untouched by civilization, okay? I mean, he doesn't say it like that, but that's been the drive. And when he gets there, he can't understand them because he can't speak the language, right? Now then, this scene from Family Life, which is the chapter before the one that I copied. Very hard to copy, get a good copy and put on. He talks about how the Nambikwara is discovered that they're not allowed to have proper names, so they're not allowed to say their proper names. So the men of the line, which means those who are working on the telegraph line, maintaining the telegraph line, and so who meet the Nambikwara and get to know them, have nicknames they use to identify them. And they could be Portuguese names or sobriquets, nicknames like rabbit or sugar or something like that, okay? Anyway, the anthropologist is sitting, playing with the kids. That's what you do when you don't know the language. And one day he is playing with a group of children. A little girl was struck by one of her comrades, and she ran to Levi-Strauss, ran to me for protection, and began to whisper something, a great secret, in my ear. As I did not understand, I had to ask her to repeat it over and over again. Eventually, because the anthropologist is effectively a child in this society. But eventually her adversary found out what was going on and came up to me in a rage and tried in her turn to tell me about what seemed to be another secret. After a little while, I was able to get to the bottom of it all, of the incident. The first little girl was trying to tell me her enemy's name. And when the enemy found out what was going on, she decided to tell me the other girl's name by way of reprisal. Thenceforward, it was easy enough, though not very scrupulous, to egg the children on one against the other, till in time I knew all of their names. And when this was completed and we were all, in a sense, one another's accomplices, I soon got them to give me the adults' names too. When this was discovered, the children were reprimanded and my sources of information dried up. So this moment from his notes is what Derrida comments on in detail, right? And it's really interesting because basically he's going to argue that because they have secret names, because they have a system of inscription, and that it's forbidden to use these names, there is a kind of marking system that he calls writing in a wider sense, right? Of course, these are Neolithic people, according to Levi-Strauss. There are people without writing, people, therefore, without history, right? Remember Derrida's interest in Husserl's geometry. Without being able to write things down, Pythagoras' theorem would have to be reinvented every time. But people without writing can have no history because they can't remember their history except through mythology and stories. Right? Now, it's interesting because Derrida finds that Levi-Strauss kind of makes the ethnocentric projection that these are a people without writing, and then for the rest of his life he spends his time showing that they really do have a kind of science in their mythology. So he kind of isn't, he's charged with ethnocentrism, but sort of isn't, and that's the point. Derrida's point is that at the very moment where Levi-Strauss is trying to be most anti-ethnocentric, ethnocentrism is smuggled in again in the logic of thinking that these people don't have writing, and they don't have writing. But do they have writing? Do they understand how writing works? Because in the second story we look at, right, it's the writing lesson proper, the bit that I have given you as translation. We do see that, scroll forward a bit to this, writing and man's exploitation by man, okay, and women. We finally open the writing lesson, finally. Derrida's doing so many asides and comment. Like at one point he starts talking about roads. You think, why is he talking about roads? The road, the highway, and so on. And then it's all about how writing is linear, like a road. A road is going from here to there. And does all writing do that? Maybe there's structure. Maybe there's, I don't know, roundabouts. And anyway, we get to this writing lesson where the scene is one where the anthropologist is about to leave, basically. And he what is the writing lesson? He's met with the leader of the Nambikwara, and he's handed out paper and pencil to all the Nambikwara. And after a few days, he finds that they're writing. Well, they're got the paper and notepad, and they're drawing lines, what they call drawing lines on the paper. They amuse themselves with these drawings. In fact, they have a name for that. He says they don't know anything about design. Well, the Kudevo have designs on their faces. So Nambikwara also have similar markings on their calabashes, right? Geometric sketches on the things they carry, right? Part of their hunting equipment. So with the paper and pencils, they draw some lines. And he says, without understanding its meaning or its end, they call the act of writing iakari ukadejutu, namely drawing lines. Well, here's the thing about metaphor, right? They've got a name for writing. Why do they have a name for writing? Drawing lines. Is drawing lines not writing? So Derrida says, well, you know, we also talk about writing as scratching, scribbling, to scrape, to trace, to imprint, as if to write is a metaphoric kernel, means something other than scratching down or chiseling words into stone or what have you, right? To say if people do not know how to write because one can translate the word with which they use to designate the act of inscribing as drawing lines is, it's not as if one could refuse them speech by translating the equivalent word of to cry, right? If they don't have a word for speaking, but instead they say shouting, does that mean they don't have speech, or sighing? So there's ethnocentric. Anthropologist is because it's translated idiomatically as drawing lines, and maybe the metaphor reference for writing is not exactly the same from one language to another, has passed the anthropologist by. And Derrida is big on this. Translation is almost impossible, and yet you've got to try and do it. And it's because of the idiomatic. Right? I mean, my difficulty, there must be experts who know about this in Ting Viet, right, is that the distinction between blue and green, Zan, and you have to add an extra word in Ting Viet to make a distinction that I see as completely clear. And I can never really know if you all don't see blue and green as closer together than I do, because we are born into a language and distinctions that are made, and it's just not exactly clear where the boundaries always are between our system of I'm sure there are experts who know more than me, and I should shut up about that. But here is an instance where perhaps the understanding of writing in the wider sense is questioned and usefully. So what happens anyway when the anthropologist is about to leave, right? So the chief of the Nambikwara, who doesn't give answers to Levi-Strauss without copying Levi-Strauss's practice of writing things down. And the chief then explains what is written, even though it's just scribbled lines, to Levi-Strauss, right? Then when they're about to leave, Levi-Strauss is going to give them some gifts. The chief kind of takes over and takes out a piece of paper from the basket covered with scribbled lines and pretends to read from it. And what does read mean? Could also be a debate. With a show of hesitation, he looked up and down his list for the objects to be given in exchange for his people's present. So the people are going to give objects for Levi-Strauss to take back to the museum in France, right? And Levi-Strauss is going to give beads and blankets and machetes and stuff, right? He's already explained at the beginning of Tristropy. So when he was in Paris, he was going through junk shops and buying bulk colored beads and rejecting especially, I think, orange ones because they break too easily or something like that, because they're valued by in trade, right? And he's good. It's terrible, this whole exchange of like a knowledge of a society is being swapped for a bunch of beads, tobacco, and other trinket, machete, and axe heads and blankets. Remembering the history of colonialism, that Manhattan Island, which is now New York, like the biggest city in, or the most significant city in the world until Shanghai, was bought by the Dutch from the Native Americans that owned it, for some blankets and some tobacco, right? Bargain, real estate. Yeah, they should be reparations. Anyway, this trade is going on, and the chief is kind of controlling the trade and showing that he's the one in control because his using this list to say who gets what. Now, it turns out the Nambikwa are one of these tribal groups that they follow their leaders so long as their leaders are good to follow, and after a while they split and change. There's not like a state structure. They're microcosm societies. And this chief apparently was deposed fairly soon after this, perhaps because he'd allied himself with the white man. But then it's a commentary that Levi-Strauss makes on this scene that becomes important for Derrida. But Levi-Strauss suggests that this chief had grasped the real meaning of writing, even though he couldn't actually write, he could only draw lines. He'd understood that writing was power, that writing was, he'd understood the administrative function of writing, the control of knowledge, right? And so that's the speculation that Derrida introduces. And I leave the reading of it to you, of course. It's fantastic, and quite amazing. At a point where Levi-Strauss is the one who is becoming an advocate for Indigenous people, right? Putting their face on the map and showing actually that their mythology, their non-history, is a kind of history. And he spends the rest of his life actually fulfilling that story. Although Derrida has said that, you know, at the very moment that he enters into this critique of Western arrogance in thinking mythology is not a kind of science or doesn't have a logic or structure, he'd actually smuggled in a very ethnocentric concept of writing, to think that these people didn't have writing when they suddenly instantaneously could grasp the politics of writing. And there's a meditation on all that means, and nothing is like so asserted so bluntly as I've had to in this summary or so on. But the idea that at the very moment you're so supportive of the other and their rights and to calling for respect, you're still imposing a set of values that are really ethnocentric, belong to a set of valuations of history, of writing, of meaning, of knowledge, of science, all that, the whole set of values and logic is smuggled in this commentary on this one scene. It's quite fantastic. And then we see it over and over in Levi-Strauss's additional work, right? He goes on next, he produces a book called The Savage Mind in English. He produces it in French, but the English title is The Savage Mind. It's La Pensée Sauvage in French, which means something different than how we would take a savage mind, right? You know, it's not like he's making a critique of Freud and Jung, saying there's no archetype or we can't describe the mind or the unconscious of a people as, you know, in every individual, but he does begin to develop comparatively a study, and this launches into Mythologiques in the next years, of how mythology reveals a kind of mode of thinking, a collective mode of thinking. But it's not savages like, savage mind is not savages like, no, it's La Pensée Sauvage. It can also mean it's the name of a flower, actually, pansy or something like that. Wild, I guess wild thought might have been a better translation of that title than savage mind. And he makes a distinction between the engineer who has tools and concepts designed for the project and a bricoleur who has projects, and then a bunch of different things that can be turned into tools. A bricklayer will make do, be a jack of all trades, where an engineer has specific tools designed to do a specific job. It makes that distinction, although I think that is also a binarism that legitimately can be said to be French theory projecting its philosophy onto people of the world. Another structuralist, for example, Louis Dumont in India, definitely does something like that when he finds the structures of Indian caste system to so neatly fit with the contemporary French philosophical trend. Anyway, what Levi-Strauss goes on to do is something much more impressive, actually. As I said, it's a 2,000 page, keep on making that mistake, 2,000 pages over 4 volumes of this series called the Mythologiques, a comparative study of Indo-European, American, and African myths. And he says that this is valid. It's not a universal mythology. It's a specific study of those myths, and what they say, how they're organized, and now he just says, against the criticism of him, if everyone may find in myths what he or she is looking for, that doesn't prove that nothing of the sort is there. I mean, he wants to say, yeah, but if we do it ethnographically and systematically, we can find a logic to the myths, a structure to the myths, and then he goes so far as to say the myths organized on this structure do actually think for themselves, and he finds the myths doing a kind of work to explain the world. Right? So how does he do this? And in the second half, we'll go through a story and work this up. He gathers ethnographic materials, collects variations of the myth story, different variations, and there are hundreds of myths that are there in the ethnographic record collected by missionaries, other anthropologists, traders, administrators, and so on. And they're collected in this bureau, this encyclopedic volumes. And he looking at what's in the myth and plotting them on a kind of map that he adopts from this kind of structure, or actually more like this. There are oppositions and so on. How do we explain this? Okay, so like, if the myth is about the story of the origin of cooking, right? Cooking comes into human, becomes something that humans have because fire has to be stolen by a great trickster culture hero figure who turns out to be Jaguar. The Jaguar. So a father and son are walking in the forest one day, and they then meet Jaguar, and Jaguar is injured in some way, and they help take out. I'm making this up. They release Jaguar from a trap or something, and in response, Jaguar, in order to go back to his family, gives them a present of fire, and then father and son are able to go back to their family, and they have cooking from then on. Right, simplified. But then on the opposition, you look at several different things in the analysis of the myth. You look at what's called the armature of the myths. That means the armature is the structure on which they're based on. So each myth will have variations of that story, but there'll be certain oppositions. Cooking, not cooking, so raw and cooked. Hungry, fed, home, jungle, and you then put the forms of the different myths, find where the similarities are, and plot them in a series of relationships on this grid. So you got oppositions on either side, home and forest, jaguar, human, right? Jaguar, turns out, once Jaguar's given over fire to the man and his son, Jaguar then turns into a wild animal in the forest, can't cook himself, in some versions of the myth. In other versions of the myth, the boy and the son steal the fire, right? And, you know, these stories exist in other mythologies too, of course. But Levi-Strauss says we need to stay connected and look at the changes, stay connected to the ethnography of the area, the context, look at the relationships, and show then how there's movement in the plot in different versions to resolve some kind of dilemma or explain some practice or emphasize some rule, like you never let the fire go out or something. Otherwise, you'll turn into a wild, you'll have to live in the forest on your own or something like this. Right, so this is kind of the structure. And we can plot this out in different stories, but I think we should probably have a break before we do that. Yeah, all right. So let me try and do that. If people have questions, they can, well, hopefully you're filling out now. You can take some time to fill out the questions on the e-learning. And then also put questions on, speak them now or in the next, whichever, well, at any point, of course, you can interrupt me, or you can put questions on the chat, do that, and we'll take some time to have that chat now. Okay, stopping